Hello, my name is Elise and I am a full-time dessert blogger. I run a website called Sweets by Elise. Type it in your browser, check out the link in my description. I specialize in really easy, really quick, indulgent recipes that are classic and ready for the home baker to conquer. I have developed over 200 recipes for my own website and lots and lots of recipes for some of the biggest food brands in the nation. I feel like I do have some baking experience under my belt and know a thing or two about the kitchen, which is why today I'm going to be answering some of the most common baking questions. I asked for you all to send in some questions on my Instagram, which is at Sweets by Elise blog. All of my social medias, which are connected to my website, are at Sweets by Elise blog. So TikTok, Pinterest, Facebook, check them out. But like I said, today's questions come from Instagram, so make sure to check me out there and send any questions that you might have or leave them in the comments below. But to get us started, the first question I got was how to make light and fluffy pastries. Mine never rise or taste right. I totally hear you. I am so finicky about my desserts. I want everything to be moist, fluffy, light. I do think that that has some things to do with the ingredients that are in the recipes that you're using. Truthfully, some of the recipes you're using may not be meant to be really moist and light and fluffy. Some cakes, for example, I think sponge cakes and pound cakes are pretty dense. So do keep that in mind. But my best tips for making light and fluffy desserts would be to use room temperature ingredients where you can. Room temperature ingredients help batters and doughs come together more smoothly and create more even desserts, which usually results in fluffier and lighter textures. Also, make sure not to overmix anything that you're baking, especially when it comes to cakes and cupcakes, anything that's really meant to be light and fluffy. If you overmix the dry ingredients when adding them into the wet ingredients, you're likely going to end up with drier and denser baked goods. And finally, make sure not to overbake. Overbaking is one of the worst things that you can do because it means you have dry cookies, you have dry cakes. It's the worst. So for cakes, cupcakes, and brownies, I bake until a toothpick inserted into the center comes out with a few crumbs on it. And for cookies, it's gonna depend a little bit based on the cookies, but they'll usually start to turn kind of pale on top and light golden around the edge. So the next question is, how long should you really let cakes cool before icing? This is a great question. I have done a lot of cakes for my blog and also local orders. And trust me, you're gonna wanna wait until the cakes have fully cooled before you frost. That's because if you add icing to warm cakes, let alone hot cakes, the icing is going to melt. And it's going to melt everywhere. Or it just might not have a lot of structure to it, which can make the cake fall apart. So regardless, you're gonna end in a big hot mess. So I recommend waiting at least an hour, sometimes even double that, truthfully. Really, I wait an hour for the cake to cool in the pan, maybe 30 to an hour in the pan, flip them out onto if you have a wire cooling rack, fabulous. If not, just put them on a plate outside of that hot pan and let them cool until you can touch the cake and it's not warm at all. The next question I got was tricks for softening butter without melting. This is a great question because most recipes that I use call for room temperature butter. Similar to what I was talking about before, the temperature of your butter and the temperature of your ingredients really makes a difference in the texture of your baked goods. I have a couple of tricks and you may think they're a little controversial. The first one is while I'm preparing all my ingredients, I stick the butter in the waistline of my pants. Of course, wrapped, but having that butter against your body heat can really make the butter soften and not too much to where you're not hot enough that it's gonna melt it, right? But the more conventional way to go about it would be to cut the butter cubes into about tablespoon. They have tablespoon markings on the butter sticks. I cut them, they don't have to be exactly correct, but about tablespoon chunks, put them on a plate, stick them in the microwave for 10 seconds, flip them over, and stick them back in the microwave for another 10 seconds. And that should do it. The next question I got was how do you get past the cleanup? That always discourages me from baking. Totally hear you. Totally hear you. I am baking probably sometimes 4 recipes a day in our sweet college apartment kitchen, so it can get pretty crazy over here. What I like to do is clean up after each step of the recipe. If I can throw things in the sink and have water soaking, great. If I can, my mom used to always say, my mom had a friend who told her one touch. If you pull out the baking soda and you quickly measure the baking soda out, put the baking soda back up. You never have baking soda touch anything, if that makes sense. So that could help as well. But truthfully, the great thing, not to plug my own recipes, but my recipes usually only require 1 bowl, at most maybe 2 bowls. So that makes cleanup a lot easier when you don't have as many things that you're working with. The next question I got was, if I don't have cake flour, can I substitute it with all-purpose flour? The answer to this question sort of depends on the recipe. First of all, I think it's really important to note that if you substitute anything in any recipe, it is not going to be the exact same as how the recipe developer wrote it. That's just the truth. Sorry about it. Sorry. But truthfully, baking is a science, and every single thing is in there for a specific reason. Who knows? Maybe you can make it even better than the recipe developer, but I just want to put that warning out there. When it comes to cake flour and all-purpose flour, they have very, very different functions. Cake flour usually results in very, to be frank, cakey, light. It lacks moisture usually, whereas all-purpose flour can create lots of gooey and fudgy textures. You can substitute all-purpose flour for cake flour if you add cornstarch. I would just look it up. I do have a couple of recipes on my website where I talk about substitutions and how to go about it, but if you just look it up, it's pretty standard. You add a couple tablespoons of cornstarch and take out a couple tablespoons of all-purpose flour and mix it together, and that's how you create cake flour. I have never gone backwards and used cake flour for all-purpose flour. The next question I got was baking soda versus baking powder for big, beautiful cookies. Totally depends on the recipe. For my go-to bakery style chocolate chip cookies, I use both, but I use more baking powder than baking soda in that recipe. It just depends on the type of cookie, the texture of the cookie, whether you're gonna need one or both, but make sure that you never interchange them. They have separate functions, they do different things, and you don't wanna just use all baking powder if baking soda and baking powder are both listed. So do keep that in mind. On to the next. Is it okay to use salted butter if the recipe calls for unsalted? What I usually say in my recipes is that if a recipe calls, basically all of my recipes call for unsalted butter, and I think that that's kind of standard in the baking world. If somebody were to use salted butter, I usually say to reduce the salt in the recipe. So for instance, if I call for half a cup of unsalted butter and there's 3/4 teaspoon of salt in the recipe, and someone needs to use salted butter, I usually recommend that they reduce the salt down to 1/4 teaspoon. Next question I got is going to make me so insanely happy to talk about. It is, how do you measure without a scale? Well, friends, for the first 20 years of my life, I've been alive for 21 at this point. For the first 20 years of my life, I measured with, okay, maybe 19. I measured with measuring cups in the US measuring cup system. And then I switched to a baking scale after a lot of pushback and stubbornness. And let me tell you, the kitchen scale has saved my life, changed my world. They are $15 on Amazon. I'll link my favorite one in the description. I do think that they are really great to have on hand. And I also think that they're much easier to bake with and lead to much less mess because you don't have to get a bunch of different cups and things messy. You literally just pour things into a bowl on top of the kitchen scale. But if you need to measure without a scale, I would do so very carefully. Baking is a science, so things are measured to be exact. Don't just throw some things. I think people do this most often with baking soda and baking powder and salt. It's just kind of eyeball, or they use a spoon that they use for their ice cream. That is just not, things are not going to work out the way that you want them to, I promise, babe. So if you're measuring without a scale, do so very carefully. If it says to pack light brown sugar, that means you really stick the sugar in there and use the back of a spoon until the cup is full. With flour, listen to me. Listen to me, please, I'm begging you. You're going to want to use a spoon to transfer the flour from your container into your measuring cups, and then you're gonna use a knife and sweep across the top, any sort of mountain. It's called leveling. You'll level off the top so that it's flat on top, and then you'll pour the flour into your batter, dough, whatever you're making. If you take that measuring cup and scoop it in your container, you are going to end up with dry, dense goodies. Promise, I promise. I'm sorry, I did it for years. I did it for you so that you don't have to. Please, I'm begging. Spoon and level. Love you. And the last question I'm gonna answer for today is, how do you make a recipe from scratch? What's the process? I'm not sure if this applies to the whole wide world, but I do think that this is a super fun question. For me, it starts with a lot of research, whether that's on the exact same recipe that I'm thinking about recreating or recipes with similar flavors or the same type of dessert. If I'm making a lemon poppy seed cookie, I might look at lemon poppy seed breads. I might look at orange poppy seed cookies and kind of get an idea of what other people are doing and try to draw some inspiration with putting my own twist on things. From there, I will make a lot of tweaks, use what I know about ingredients in general and baking in general to create a recipe that I want to test. I'll usually test the recipe in a half batch first. It's really easy to do that with a kitchen scale because I can use grams and not have to do like, you know, if I have a third of a cup, you can't really do half of a third of a cup easily, accurately, I should say. But another thing that I am always looking to do is to use my own recipes as a base for other new recipes. For example, if I'm making a chocolate turtle cupcake, which I believe is chocolate, caramel, and pecans, I already have a chocolate cupcake recipe that's tried and true that I love using, and I can use that cupcake as a base and kind of adapt from there to make it into a chocolate turtle cupcake. So I do that most often because I do have a big base of recipes already that I can pull from. So that is how I create new recipes and crank out lots of things for the blog. So I'm thinking that that is all for today. I am loving answering these questions and think I might put the rest of them into a separate video, but I'm so glad that I got to answer these. It is such a blast for me to talk about baking. It is my world. It's my full-time job. And if you have any questions, be sure to leave them in the comments or message me through any of my social medias. Like I mentioned, I'm at Sweets by Elise blog on Instagram, Facebook, Pinterest, and TikTok, or you can leave, like I said, a comment below with any questions that you have. Be sure to subscribe for more baking related content. I would love to have you here. And as always, happy baking.